Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot and a PMDG 777 beta tester. In today's video I want to explain to you the simulation options in the PMDG Boeing 777 and I want to tell you which one my personal favorites are. So let's get right into it. So first of all, where do we find these options? You go via menu and you can do this on any of the three CDUs. I'm using the center one here, but any of them works. Then you go via PMDG setup, options, simulation. So there are two sets of options that you have available. You have the simulation options that we are looking at in this video, and then you also have the airline configuration options. Those are located in a different menu, and generally speaking, the options we're looking at today are the, let's call it, non-realistic options. So those are the ones that only apply to the flight simulation, while the other set of options is airline options and therefore stuff that is available to airlines in the real world. Now, let's go right into it. So, starting at the simulation options page 1, we've got correct localizer course to Microsoft Flight Simulator. This basically sets the course of your ILS and adjusts it to whatever the course is in the database of Microsoft Flight Sim. The advantage of this option is that sometimes the course in MSFS itself is off compared to the real world, and if you have this option on, then it is going to adjust the course to whatever MSFS needs so that your airplane can fly the approach just fine, even though you don't have the real world course set. So basically this is an option like slightly adjust my realistic numbers to those numbers from the sim in order to make me work better in the sim. I recommend to keep this on. Next up we have realistic autopilot engagement, and this one basically means that you need to have your flight controls in the neutral position to be able to engage the autopilot. In the real world, when you got a strong input on your control column, let's say for example your airplane is not in trim and you are constantly pulling on the control column, then you cannot engage the autopilot. In the sim, that one's been made an option for you, just to make your life a little bit easier as a flight simmer, especially when you're not operating with an expensive control column, but when you're using a cheap controller where it might not be that easy to trim it out. Then having this option on means you got to do it realistically. That's what I personally recommend. But having the option off, with a cheap controller you can always engage the autopilot, regardless if you still have some deflection on the control input or not. Now the next option is one of my personal favorites in a combination there, that is show thrust lever position, and we got a couple options here that's either no, yes, or when moving. Now, to understand this option we gotta understand how the real world aircraft works, and in the real world whenever your autothrottle is moving the thrust levers, then your thrust changes. So in other words, whenever autothrottle changes your thrust, the thrust levers will be moving. This means that as soon as autothrottle is engaged in the simulator, there will be a discrepancy between your physical joystick throttle position and your simulator thrust lever position. Now, when that is the case, and when you want to deactivate autothrottle, then it would be very nice if you could match your simulator thrust lever to the simulated thrust lever first. And the way PMDG is doing this is when autothrottle is on, then instead of just getting that normal indication of where your target thrust is like we have over here, you also get your blue indication on top of this. So you get a blue indication that shows you where your hardware thrust lever is. Now, if you have this option continuously on, so if you've got show thrust lever position yes, then you will basically always see your joystick thrust lever position. Now that's of course not realistic, since in the real world you don't have this blue indication on your N1 gauges. Now, if you switch this one to when moving, then you will only see your joystick throttle if auto thrust is engaged and if you actually change your thrust lever position. In my opinion, this is a very good compromise between getting a realistic indication on the ICAS and actually seeing where your joystick is so that you can match it properly before disconnecting Autothrottle. So my recommendation here is when moving. Next we've got show fly-by-wire trim reference speed, and this is a really neat option. So in the actual 777 you do not get to see which speed your aircraft is trimmed to in manual flight, because you can feel it on the control column. You just fly it like a conventional airplane, but fly-by-wire internally has that target speed, similar to the speed bug set over here. It has that target speed that it will trim the airplane for. Now, in the simulator, due to lack of input feeling on the joysticks, it might just be a little bit hard to actually set that speed bug properly. So what you can do is you can visualize that trim reference speed using the option down here. This is in the simulation options because the real 777 cannot do this. Contrary to, for example, the Airbus 220, that one actually can show the trim reference speed in the real world as well. Now, my opinion here is that you can switch this menu off or set it to no if you've got a good high quality joystick, because you will be able to trim the airplane anyway. But if you don't have such a good joystick, or if you just struggle to get your aircraft in trim, then turn this one on, and whenever the autopilot is off and you're in manual flight, you will see that blue trim reference speed pop up on the speed indicator on your primary flight display, which makes it a little bit easier to actually trim your aircraft out. And especially when you're learning hand flying the 777, this might be a good option for you to have a look at. Next up we've got high idle on flare. Now this option kind of compensates for the inaccuracies in ground effect in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Basically what it does is to increase your idle thrust during the final approach and keep you a little bit more thrust in the flare when you pull the power off. That makes the airplane land a little bit smoother and makes it a bit harder to get a hard landing. Now in my opinion, keep this one off because the plane lands pretty nice anyway. Now on the bottom here on the first page we got the IRS options. If we go to that, we can choose between different alignment times, and well, realistic obviously is the most realistic option there, so that's what I recommend to use. And at the bottom you've got use last memory position. Now this is a function that some aircraft actually have available, others don't. And this option basically enables the FMS to remember the last position where the IRS has been turned off. Maintenance is normally using that option quite a bit in real aircraft, so that's why you have it available over here. However, you've got to be pretty careful with it, because the last memory position of course refers to the position where your IRS has last been turned off, and unless you load a flight at exactly the same gate again, or to give you the real world equivalent, unless the aircraft has not been towed to a different position, then this option can cause quite some trouble in the sim, and that's the reason why you can find it down there and not in the airline options. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. Now over here it's getting a little bit more technical, and luckily there's not all that much we need to do over here. But the one important, or the two important settings you've got on the simulation 2 page is the two ones at the top. So Autothrottle, manual override. And you can see the different options we have is in hold mode only, never, and always. Now, in the real world, when Autothrottle is operating the thrust levers for you, and you want to take over manually for whatever reason, then you can either simply disconnect Autothrottle, but what most pilots would tend to do is just to override the thrust levers. Just put your hands on them and move them around as you see necessary. So let's say Autothrottle is flying a little bit fast or is a little bit too slow to react to a gust. Pilots would just take the thrust lever, move them manually to the position that you want, so that your speed changes as you want it, and then just let go of the thrust levers again and Autothrottle will take over again. In the simulator, of course, that's a little bit hard to realize, so what PMDG enables you to do with the Autothrottle manual override button is whenever you change your simulator, or rather your physical thrust lever position, is that going to override Autothrottle. And the options you have here start with always. In that case, regardless of the mode that Autothrottle is in, you would always override your Autothrottle. Now, if you've got a joystick that's sending out a little bit of noise, then this option would basically make your Autothrottle inoperative, even though it would be the most realistic. In the real world, you can always override Autothrottle. So you can always change the thrust lever position, and when you let go, it's going to return. With one difference, if it is in hold mode. So when hold mode is active, and that is the second option we have, when hold mode is active, then your thrust levers are just going to remain wherever you set it. Hold mode is basically used in two different situations. The first of them is takeoff. So when you click the toga button, you're going to go into thrust ref. That means that Autothrottle is going to set your thrust levers so that you achieve exactly the reference thrust that you've got up here. Now, when you are transitioning from thrust ref into hold, which happens at 80 knots, then you can basically change your thrust lever position and the airplane is just going to use whatever new position you assign. The background behind this is that, let's say you are on takeoff run, you notice that you have insufficient thrust, you just decide to increase it. For example, because wind shear is becoming a possibility now, or for whatever other reason, then you are just going to maintain that thrust. On the contrary, if you're still in thrust ref, so below 80 knots, and you change your thrust, then you let go of the thrust levers, then they just return you to the previously commanded takeoff thrust. Now, this means if you've got the in hold mode only option, then your physical joystick hardware might override the Autothrottle command. Now this happens to quite a couple of flight simmers who have a joystick that's not very good, and they move the thrust levers up to stabilize at 50%, and then they just press toga, the thrust spools up to takeoff thrust, but when it changes to hold mode at 80 knots, then the engines return back to 55% because the joystick is sending out some noise. Now, this can be a bit dangerous, but this can usually be overcome if your joystick sends out noise and you push the thrust levers to 55%, the engine stabilize, you press toga. I recommend to put the thrust levers all the way forward, your physical ones that is. Normally, joysticks that send out noise have the least chance to do that at this position. Now, the other benefit here of in hold mode only is that your Autothrottle would also use hold mode when you are in level change or in VNAV in the descent, and in there, after it positions the thrust levers to the position you want, then it changes to hold. And if it does that, then you can manipulate your thrust levers to adjust the rate of descent of your aircraft. So that's why my favorite here is in hold mode only. You just gotta ensure that during takeoff your joystick is not going to override the takeoff thrust setting. Now the last setting you'd have available here is never. In my opinion, you just use the feature too often to just set this one to never. So my recommendation here is in hold mode only. You just gotta make sure that during takeoff your physical joystick does not override your takeoff thrust setting. Below that you've got Autothrottle flare idle override. Now this one simulates that sometimes when you're doing an approach with Autothrottle enabled, then the Autothrottle in flare would slowly retard the thrust levers from about 25 feet radio. Now, if you're descending particularly quickly, then, or if you're coming in particularly fast, then pilots have a tendency, let's say your thrust is here, Autothrottle is slowly pulling off the thrust, the pilot would just take the thrust levers and slam them all the way down. And this way you can kind of simulate this. So Autothrottle flare idle override, basically you can just slam your thrust levers back. Now the control column null zones, I would just keep them where they are by default, as that is going to normally have no effect. Only if your airplane is doing weird things, like the controls are constantly overriding themselves, then I would consider increasing those override or those null zones over here a little bit in order to eliminate some noise, but normally the default values work very good. Now the one on the bottom, turbulence mode trigger, basically means the following. Boeing autoflight systems have a turbulence mode, and turbulence mode basically means that the airplane will change from maintaining the exact airspeed or the exact altitude to providing a little bit smoother flight. So, say for example, you are entering turbulence in flight and the speed changes plus minus 3 or 4 knots or something. Then, when turbulence mode is triggered, your autothrottle is no longer going to try and chase your target speed, but much rather it's just going to maintain a constant thrust setting and accept the deviation from your target speed. And this setting down here basically controls when this turbulence mode activates. You cannot visually see that the mode is active. There is no indication to the pilot that the mode is actually in use. But down here you can set the target. So 1 knot is the default value. That means whenever the speed is varying more than 1 knot in a certain period in time, then this turbulence mode is internally going to be enabled. I recommend to keep it at the standard 1 knot. It seems to work rather well. On page number 3 we've got the service-based failures. Now I surely recommend those to be on. Service-based failures mean that any component and equipment in the aircraft that's equipped with a failure simulation is going to fail based on realistic maintenance time. So, say your aircraft has not seen maintenance for 1,000 hours, chances are something might fail. Also, it always gives you that certain probability. So, with service-based failures on, normally your aircraft is going to be very reliable, just like a real aircraft. But there is always a chance of, let's say, 1 in a million or whatever, that an engine failure might happen at V1. The chance is there, even though it is very, very small. And depending on the components, depending on how well you maintain them, you might see failures happen more often, especially if you don't do maintenance at all, then the failure rate is going to increase. In my opinion, this just adds some, let's call it some non-reliance to all the aircraft components. You can't just assume 100% that nothing is going to happen. Chances that something happens are very small, but something can happen. And I really like that. Below we've got save fluid on exit. Now this option basically means that stuff like your oil quantity, so we've got the engine oil quantity down here, or your hydraulic quantity, your oxygen, and all that stuff is going to be saved when you exit the simulator, and is going to come back when you load the same aircraft the next time. Note that this is dependent on the livery, so every single one livery is going to have its own values, and it's not going to be fleet-wide. Now, in order for the save to work, just because that question does come up every now and then, in order for the save to work, you basically got to exit the simulator normally. So you press the escape button, then you go back to the menu, and then you close the sim from the menu. If you don't do that, well, then it might not save correctly. I recommend to have this one on, because it means you need to do a proper pre-flight procedure, and because it means that if you really mess it up, if you just don't check for any fluids, and if you just don't care, well, you might just about wear it down, and if there is insufficient oil in the engine, eventually metal will meet metal, and the results can be rather spectacular. So the third option over here, display unit power up. Basically, if you start the airplane cold and dark, it takes the 777 about 2 or 3 minutes until the displays are actually powering up. Now, I recommend to keep this on realistic, but if you go for fast, then it's just going to go a lot quicker. So next up we got the page number 4, and on here there's a couple of settings I recommend. So first of all, you got synchronized captain and first officer Efis panels. Now, what is synchronized here is basically the settings you make up here, but only some of them. So the settings you can synchronize is the altimeter setting and the minimum setting. Now those are settings that typically both pilots would have to set independent of one another, but where both pilots need to make the same input. The reason to do it independent of one another is to serve as a cross-check. Let's say that one pilot incorrectly reads the QNH, then the other one just doesn't copy it from him. And you can make a couple different settings here. So you've got synchronized barometric and minimums. That means altimeter and minimum. You can also just choose not to synchronize anything, or you can go for altimeters only, or altimeters and minimums. My recommendation here is to synchronize both the altimeter and the minimum, because, well, in the real world, captain and first officer would set them independently of one another. In the simulation, well, you don't have the second crew member, so for that reason, well, I prefer to keep them linked to one another. So below that, you've got synchronized captain and standby altimeter. Now, that would synchronize the altimeter setting on the standby with the altimeter setting done up here on the Efis control panel. I keep this one off because in the real world, the pilot flying normally needs to set the standby altimeter manually. And there is no automatic synchronization since it's an independent system. So for that reason, if you're simulating real world operation, then as pilot flying you gotta make two altimeter settings, on your PFD and on your standby. And well, if you are lazy and you have this option synchronized, so set to yes, then your standby altimeter is just going to set together with the primary altimeter. That's not the case in the real world. In the real world you normally need to do that yourself, so that's why I prefer to have this one off. The next options are going to be dedicated to callouts, so we'll go over them quickly. Pilot not flying, currently, or rather outdated term, should be pilot monitoring nowadays, calls out airspeed. That's when your speed is increasing during the takeoff run, and some companies would call something like airspeed alive, something like that. Most airlines don't do that. For that reason, I've got this option set off. Next, we have the 80 knots cross-check, and this one I set on. Now, any airline does that. In any airline, it's standard that the pilot monitoring is going to call 80 knots in the 777 during takeoff. For that reason, I would set this one to yes. Now, the actual idea why you even have an option for this is that there are some add-ons available that add this call automatically, such as FS2 crew. And for those add-ons you would disable it so that FS2 crew can then do the call out. But overall, I recommend to have this one on. Next we have pilot monitoring calls out V1. Now, I recommend to keep this one on no, because most 777s have an automatic V1 call fitted, so the computer is going to call V1 by the time you reach it. For this reason, if you simply keep this one to no, then there will not be a double V1 call. The computer does it for you, your pilot monitoring doesn't need to do it. For that reason I have it off. Now going on then, next we have pilot monitoring calls out VR, and the computer cannot do that automatically, but in any airline the pilot monitoring will call rotate, and that is what you enable over here. For that reason I have it set to yes. And again, the reason why this option even exists, why the call isn't permanent, is that if you have a third-party add-on like FS2 crew, then that add-on can make the call, but normally keep it on yes. Next we got pilot monitoring calls out V2, and that's something that very few airlines actually do. So in some airlines it is standard to call out V2 when you reach it. The vast majority of airlines don't do it. For that reason I recommend to keep this one set to no. The next option is pilot monitoring calls out positive rate, and yep, happens in any airline. For that reason again I recommend to turn this one on to yes. Going down further, we've got automatic step climbs. Now, this is an option that may serve handy if you are flying those long hauls and you are actually not anywhere nearby your computer. Personally, I've got this on no, and I recommend that if you are flying online, if you fly on VATSIM, always use no. Because, well, it does happen that you miss a step climb, or that you miss a step climb approaching, and then your aircraft starts climbing without an ATC clearance. So for that reason, keep this one on no. Even keep this one on no if you do not fly online, because then you can still activate your step climbs manually over here in the Universal Flight Tablet Auto Cruise menu. You can still turn on auto step climbs when you are leaving your computer. In my opinion, this is a better option. So just keep it on no down here. Pause at top of descent, the same thing. If you're flying online, I recommend to have this one turned off. If you're not flying online, then use it at your convenience. Personally, I am not a big fan of that option, so I'm keeping it on no, but just use it as it suits your personal simulation needs. Going on, we've got the auto time compression controls. Now, the upper one, maximum automatic time compression rate, can be set either in here in the FMC or through the universal flight tablet menu. So up here, auto cruise menu, you can also control the maximum compression rate. I recommend to use the one here in the universal flight tablet again. But by default, in my opinion, 4x is a good value to have set in the simulation options in the FMC. And the reason behind that is that normally Microsoft Flight Simulator runs just about fine at 4x, but if you're going 8x over congested areas, like if you fly 8x over Europe or over the US, then your sim might start to encounter issues. For that reason, I recommend 4x maximum. The next one is a really nice one. That's chrono button right turn. So the chrono button is the one you've got down here on your clock. In the real world, it's just a simple push-in button. You push it in and the chronometer starts running. But in the simulator, PMDG slightly changed it. You can turn it to the right, or you can turn it to the left. If you turn it to the left, then basically it does the same that the button does when you push it in the real world. But if you turn it to the right, then it can serve different functions. Now, there's two functions available. You either have automatic time compression, and that is what we just saw. So when you are using that function, then turning that button to the right is going to basically tell the airplane as a quick shortcut, yes, I want automatic time compression now. This is a little bit of a leftover from the times where PMDG didn't have a universal flight tablet yet, so basically from the P3D version and FSX version of the aircraft, because back then you otherwise would have to go into the FMC and enable auto time compression in here. Now, that was rather annoying to do all the time, so you had that shortcut available. The other option you have available over here is direct simulation rate control, and that is one that I particularly like. So, like this, if I now turn that button to the right, now I've got 2x time acceleration, turn it to the right again, I've got 4x, right again, 8x, and so on. And then a left turn just returns it to real life time again. And this is my recommended setting down here, direct sim rate control, because it makes it a little bit easier and a little bit more comfortable to manually control your time acceleration rate. For that reason, I recommend to have this one set to direct sim rate control. Note that if your aircraft has digital watches fitted, so clock type digital up here in the airline options, then this option is going to be grayed out, because as you can see, that button no longer exists in your cockpit. So then we can go on to the next page, and that is a little bit of interaction stuff with your sim. So audio control panel controlling Microsoft Flight Simulator. That one basically chooses, if you've got it set to captain only, then only the left audio control panel will make your input to MSFS. So over here you can select which radio you want to use and so on. And if you've got this set to first officer only, then the first officer's panel would control it. Or you have an option either captain or FO. Then basically the panel that you last made an input on is going to be the one controlling the simulator. Now, if you are only flying from the left seat, I recommend to keep this on captain only. If you're exclusively flying as first officer, I recommend FO only. And only if you change between seats, let's say you want to simulate one flight from the captain seat, the next one from the FO seat, or if you want to simulate operating as a senior first officer where you basically change your seat in flight from the right to the left seat, then I recommend to use the both options. But normally, let's say you only fly from the captain seat, then keep it on captain only. The yoke option below that basically controls whether your yokes are showing realistically like they are right now, which can sometimes block the view on the controls a little bit, or if you go to the hidden position, then they are just going to move to a lower position. This one does not exist in the real aircraft. This is purely fictional, but when you do that, then you basically ensure that the yokes are no longer going to be able to obstruct any of your instrument views. I recommend to keep it on normal. You always got a click spot on the top of the yoke as well that you can use to move it more or less in real time if you need quick access to some instruments and don't want to change your view. So I recommend to keep this one in normal. Lastly, going on to the last page we've got two more options for your interface with the airplane controls. The upper one is steering hardware type. Now, this one really depends on how you are using your hardware. You've got as option rudder only and tiller and rudder. Now, if you select the more realistic one, tiller and rudder, then you have a split between the rudder pedal inputs that you can do over here, and you can see now I can move my rudder pedals without moving the airplane tiller. This is of course how it would work in the real world. But since many flight simulators do not have separate access for a tiller, they kinda want to use the rudder in order to control the tiller as well, and that is what you can select up here with rudder only. So select this depending on whatever kind of hardware you use. For example, if you use a separate joystick to control a tiller, then I recommend to use tiller and rudder. Otherwise, go rudder only. Really use it as it fits your hardware setup. The last one is park and brake, and you can choose between simple and realistic. Now, simple means that you simply click the park and brake button and the park and brake is going to set. That does not work in the real airplane. In the real airplane, in order to be able to set the park and brake, you got to press your rudder pedals in, and now when they're pressed in, you can set the park and brake. And when I now want to release the pedals, you can see they basically are held in position over here. And that is how it works in the real aircraft. But to give flight simmers a choice what to use, you can choose down here whether you want the simple setup where you only click the lever down here, or the realistic one where you have to press the brake pedals first in order to be able to set the park and brake. For maximum realism, of course I recommend to use the realistic option. Well, and that's the different simulation options we got available in the PMDG Boeing 777. I hope that you found this one interesting. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my recommended settings over here. Personally, those settings that I have just recommended represent, in my opinion, the best compromise between realism and flight simulation, but of course everyone might feel different about that, so if you prefer a different setting, then do let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. As always, like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing over here on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.